Life in the Big Ten did not promise to be easy, regardless of the opponent. And USC got a dose of that in Minneapolis. But time to lick the wounds and, of course, get ready for one of the biggest challenges of the season, Penn State at the Coliseum. This is one of those matchups, of course, that we circled when the four from the Pac-12 made their way to the Big Ten in regards to can't wait to see this one. All right, appreciate you being here, the voice of college football. It's another Tuesday night, Trojan Conquest edition number 121. The guy that makes it all work for us, of course, is Matt Zemek, Trojans Wire. Tim, not able to make it tonight, but Tim will be back soon. And we appreciate Marty Leap, our special guest tonight from Penn State Rivals, to get the side from the Nittany Lions. Appreciate you guys being here.
Yeah, absolutely. Looking forward to it.
All right. Comments and questions. We will take those in the chat, of course. We appreciate the super chat contributions, folks. And Matt, I got to get your take on this Minnesota game, because for me, this was not a choice of a game selection for me. I can only focus on two. There were other options, but with about 10 or 11 minutes left, I thought, okay, I've got to get to this one. And that's what I saw. And what I saw was Miller Moss running for his life, throwing the ball out of bounds continuously. Offensive line pass pro issues popped up and reared their ugly head again.
That's right. And, when things go off the rails, when a season goes wrong, people want it. They're not necessarily most people, but you always find a faction of a fan base. It's not always a majority. In some cases, it's just a vocal minority that wants the coach fired and wants the quarterback to be changed. And that latter part, like, I can understand people being fed up with Lincoln Riley. Like, it's year 3 and we're not seeing overall progress. I mean, it's better than last year, but as I wrote over the weekend at Trojans Wire, USC is playing catch up. That might not be the thing that anyone around the program wants to hear. It's certainly not what fans want to hear, but that's reality. Like, 2023 put this program behind the 8 ball. It undid a lot of progress from 2022. Recruiting, portal pickups, just 2023 damaged the program's brand and reputation. And you saw the lack of depth, right? As soon as Anthony Lucas gets hurt, with Eric Gentry already being out, and the defense did really well without Eric Gentry being on the field for the first 50 minutes, and Bear Alexander's not in there because he left the program. Defense did a great job in those first 50 minutes. But then you add Anthony Lucas, and that was like the straw that broke the camel's back, right? So that's one part of all this. And then the other part is with Miller Moss. We said it all along. He needed help, because he's not Caleb Williams. And that's not a criticism either. It's just Miller Moss cannot put on his cape and go win a ball game by himself the way Caleb Williams sometimes did, sometimes could for USC. Miller Moss needed all his teammates to be there for him. And on the offensive line, with that Minnesota outside pass rush, getting to Miller Moss on that 3rd and 4, hitting his arm, causing that interception, that's not Miller Moss's fault. That is the pass protection breaking down. He did not have a chance on that play. It becomes an interception as opposed to an incomplete pass. And then that shorthanded defense without Anthony Lucas, credit Minnesota for, taking advantage of attrition. USC did not have as many quality bodies as it needed, and just the tidal wave swamped the Trojans in the final 10 minutes. And I go back to this point of emphasis one more time. Lead by 10, lead by 14, so that one huge mistake doesn't cause the whole house to come tumbling down. It's what we saw against Michigan, right? The big run at the end of the game, it cost USC because USC was up by only 4. And by the way, that Michigan team that USC lost to, Washington handled them. And so that loss to Michigan now looks even worse. So you can't be playing these tight one-score games against relatively average teams. Minnesota is not a bad team, but no one would call Minnesota an elite team. No one would call Michigan this year an elite team. You should be 10, 14 points better so that a big mistake, a key injury, one tipping point factor doesn't just swamp everything. And that's where USC is. And And so the final point before we bring in Marty for the Penn State perspective is that Lincoln Riley went to the well. And I mean, you hear all sorts of coaches do this. They're like, we're just 2 plays away from being undefeated. You know, we're right there. We're so close. No one wants to hear that, Lincoln. No one wants to hear you talk about how close USC is. You know, if USC was 1 play away from beating 2023 Michigan, you know, a national championship level team, if USC was 1 play away from beating Ohio State or Oregon, a top 3 team, okay, different conversation. But Minnesota and 2024 Michigan are bang on average teams. No one wants to hear about how you came so close to beating average teams. And so that's a bunch of Clay Helton sunshine pumping idiocy. Lincoln Riley should know better. I just can't stand it when he tries to spin highly negative situations into positives, because there's not much positive right now at USC, and Lincoln Riley needs to level with his fan base.
Before we get to Marty, real quick, this is awesome. We appreciate you, QLJ. He's become a YouTube member here at the Voice of College Football USC. Thank you so much for that, QLJ. You will not be disappointed. We appreciate you being on board. And then we also have Detective Loki. Thank you. Appreciate gifting 1 at USC at the Voice of College Football membership. Appreciate you being here all the time. All right, Marty. I'm going to give you my take on Penn State. Saw the West Virginia game, saw most of the Illinois game, saw some of the UCLA game. It appeared to me the last 2 weeks, despite what the stats are telling us, that Penn State has addressed that explosive play issue on offense. The stats will tell that. I know that I saw a stat during the UCLA game. I don't know what it is after the completion of that game, but 16th in the nation in explosive plays after being number 111 last year. But in the Illinois and UCLA games, it very much had the feel of James Franklin determining early in that game, both games, you can't score on my defense, so we're going to pack it in, play it conservatively, maybe save some of the repertoire, some of the playbook, but you can't score on us. Illinois scored a quick touchdown in the first drive, well-orchestrated drive. Then after that, forget it, nothing. And obviously UCLA has, nothing to show on the offensive side of the ball this year. And that was it just reeked of conservative play calling and conservative approach, but understandably so.
Yeah, I mean, first off, the explosive play thing definitely it's been addressed, and in a big way. I mean, like you said, going into the UCLA game, you ranked 16th nationally, and against the Bruins, even though the offense wasn't quite as explosive as it had been, and a big part of that was not having Nicholas Singleton, you still had 4 plays of at least 15 yards, which, I mean, obviously you want more than that, but in a game where you don't have your most explosive offensive weapon, you're going to take that. And James Franklin came out and said yesterday that barring any sort of setback this week, they fully anticipate Singleton being a full go on Saturday. I know he said after the UCLA game that, right up to kickoff, they expected to have him. And I honestly do think had USC been last Saturday and UCLA this week, I think Singleton would have played last week. I think he knew against the opponent that they were going to be fine without him. And like you said, Mark, the last 2 weeks, very much you got that vibe. Like they knew the defense wasn't giving up more than 7 points, and they called the game accordingly. And against UCLA, I give them a lot of credit too, because I think you look at that UCLA game, it's the week after Illinois, which was essentially a de facto whiteout, top 20 opponent, Big Ten conference opener. You have the big showdown at USC this week, noon kickoff. That thing had sloppy sleepwalk sandwich game written all over it. UCLA, to their credit, played very hard that team's got a lot of holes, but they played hard. I will give them that. And Penn State's offense, once they woke up midway through the second quarter, they scored on their final 7 possessions. They scored 5 times, and one of the times they didn't is because they knelt the clock out. So once that offense hit a gear Saturday afternoon against the Bruins, they took off and went. And even against Illinois, if you make 2 field goals, 2 inside 40-yard field goals like college kickers need to make, and they have since made a change at kicker, you win that game by 20, and it looks a lot different too. But I will give Andy Koldernicki a lot of credit for both of those games, the offense coordinator, because against Illinois, it was very clear that for whatever reason, Drew Allar was just off just enough that night, and he knew that they could maul Illinois in the trenches, and that's what they did, and just ran the ball down their throats. And against UCLA, again, to their credit, they played hard. Penn State struggled to run the ball at times, but Drew Allar was the complete opposite of what he was against Illinois. He was locked in. He looked really good. And, they hit a couple big pass plays. All 4 of their plays at 15-plus yards against UCLA came through the air. You saw Trey Wallace being explosive again. You saw Liam Clifford have his first career 100-yard game, including a 57-yard catch. So, yeah, the explosiveness has been fixed. And, like you said, I think the last 2 weeks it was very much they knew the defense wasn't going to give up more than a touchdown. They knew that they probably could keep some things under wraps offensively that they can bust out this weekend and then against Ohio State in a couple of weeks. And just the coaching staff did what good coaching staffs do. They saw where they had the advantage. They saw where they could exploit their opponent, and they exploited their opponent and won. And, people can gripe all they want about only beating a top 20 Illinois team by 14, by only beating UCLA by 16. That's back-to-back Big Ten wins by a combined 30 points. And when you look at everything else that happened on Saturday, it was one of those Saturdays in college football. So, you should be happy to get out with a victory, especially a double-digit victory over a conference opponent.
So Marty, I think you can tell I'm not giving USC a whole lot of a chance this week. I'm not going to pretend that I'm leaning to USC. I definitely think Penn State wins this game. I'm not going to say lock of the week, but I'm pretty solidly on the Penn State side, purely in terms of predicting which team will win. So I just want to put that out there. That said, if I'm in a Penn State mindset, if I'm on the Penn State side, and obviously you cover Penn State, my worry is that Illinois and UCLA on offense will not prepare Penn State for what they're going to see from USC in terms of the difference in skill level. I mean, there is a lot of talent on this USC side. So how concerned do you think Penn State is? How concerned do you think Penn State should be about the significant jump in overall playmaking talent and potency that Penn State's going to see from the Trojans?
Yeah, I think that's a legitimate point because you look at this USC passing attack. I mean, personally, I would argue that because of the difference in quarterback play, this is the best passing attack they'll face all year, even a little bit more so than Ohio State, because I think Ohio State has better receivers. USC receivers are no slouches themselves, but from a passing standpoint, I would take Miller Moss over Will Howard any day of the week. That said, I also think that if you look at where Penn State's defense potentially has some weaknesses, it's at linebacker. That's an area you worry about USC exploiting the middle of the field. And the secondary has played really, really well without KJ Winston, but this is the first test against a really good passing attack without your preseason All-American safety. Until you see it, you're going to have some concerns back there. So I think if you're Tom Allen in this defense, that's where your concerns are coming into this, is you have some injuries at linebacker, and linebacker was a question mark coming into the year to begin with. And without Winston at safety, how are you going to defend this USC passing attack? I think what's going to be important is getting this pass rush home because, like you said, this is going to be a much different offense they saw with Illinois, definitely much different than what they saw with UCLA. So those games didn't prepare them for this. But I think if you're Penn State, you need to come out, obviously be thinking pass first throughout this game. You're going to probably put a lot on your corners in this game. A.J. Harris, Jalen Kimber, Cam Miller, they've all played extremely well this year. And to help alleviate some pressure off the younger safeties who are going to be out there in the absence of KJ Winston. And I think what's going to be most important is getting that pass rush home. And I mean, obviously we'll get into this, but I don't think there's anywhere on this field where the gap between the two sides may be wider than in the trenches. So I think that's where Penn State's going to feel good about it is, you might put your secondary in some tough spots against some really good receivers and a really good quarterback, but you're going to trust your defensive line to win more times than not on Saturday afternoon.
Now, USC, as I mentioned at the top of the show, no Eric Gentry, no Bear Alexander, not because of injury, but because he redshirted and has declared to enter the portal. And then you lose Anthony Lucas late in that Minnesota game, and it obviously had an effect. And, in terms of like USC maybe not being prepared for the level of talent it's going to face against Penn State, like Drew Aller is a few notches better than Brosmer of Minnesota, than Braden Locke of Wisconsin. So from my own USC vantage point, I'm worried that Drew Aller is going to be a few steps up in weight class as a quarterback. How much do you think Penn State's passing game can feast on what is an undermanned USC defense at this point?
I think if they're clicking, it can, because we've seen at times this year this passing game look really good. I mean, James Franklin will tell you up and down, and I have a hard time disagreeing with him, that Tyler Warren is the best tight end in the country, and he is an absolute weapon on this offense. And the receivers, I mean, anyone who watched me with Mark throughout the offseason, we talked about the wide receiver position up and down. And to their credit, they have taken a huge step this year. They're still not where you want them to be, but Trey Wallace has emerged as a legitimate top-of-the-line guy. Liam Clifford keeps getting better. Julian Fleming is starting to look a lot more settled into this offense, and Omari Evans has been the home run guy. I do wonder, Evans is one I really think they could use on Saturday because, as you mentioned, you have some question marks in this USC defense, or in the secondary, excuse me. They may be a little depleted. Evans is the fastest guy on the team. I think he's got, off the top of my head, I'm going to say he has 3 catches of 50-plus yards this year already. And he's also drawn a couple pass interferences. So he's been good at go take the top off the defense and either run past them and catch it or draw a flag. So I'll be curious to see if that's something, especially early in the game, where if you're Penn State and you want to come out and try and take this thing by the throat, if we see a deep shot there. Now, all of that said, and I have a lot of faith in Drew Aller, he has been much, much better this year than last year. The best road game of his career was at Maryland last year. And, some USC fans who are disgruntled might disagree with this right now, but I still feel very confident saying USC is a better team than Maryland. So you still want to see him do it on the road against a good team. I mean, he had a good game this year against West Virginia, so maybe I should give him that one because this West Virginia squad, I think, is still probably going to wind up winning like 8 or so games in the Big 12. But until you see him really do it on the road against a quality conference opponent, that's the one thing we still haven't really seen from Drew yet. So I think this is a big chance for him this weekend, too, to kind of silence some people on that front. I mean, obviously, this game doesn't look as formidable and intimidating as it did a week ago at this time, but it's still USC. They're still a brand name. You're in the Coliseum. If you come out and put up big numbers, that's going to do a lot for you. But we need to see that from him. But I am confident in their ability to get the passing game going on Saturday as long as they can get out of their own way. Because a lot of times this year in the passing game has struggled. It's been self-inflicted. Against UCLA, for example, first drive of the game, second snap of the game, Drew has Julian Fleming open for about a 20-yard gain, and Fleming drops the ball. And in the next route, Fleming should have cut the route off a little bit sooner than he did. Throw goes behind him. Had he cut that route off when he should have, it's a big gain and a first down. So they've struggled at times to kind of get it into rhythm, but once that passing game has gotten into rhythm, they've done very well.
How much is James Franklin emphasizing the need to have quicker starts? And here at USC, there's been first half USC and second half USC, and USC needs to play 30 bad minutes to finally wake up. And USC is the best third quarter team in the country, or at least one of. USC has played extremely strong third quarters across the board this season, but it just can't get the engines going in the first half, and especially the first quarter. And Penn State, like I've noticed, I haven't watched your games really closely, but the offense took time to get going against UCLA, didn't have the great first quarter against Illinois. How much of a talking point, how much of a point of emphasis is it for Penn State? Hey, we need to start playing strong first quarters, strong first halves.
Yeah, that was something James talked a lot about at his press conference this week, is that fast start. Because, like you've said, that's offensively, that's been a problem, these slow starts. And most of these games, once the offense has gotten into a rhythm, they've rolled. Like I said, 5 out of 6 drives against UCLA, they scored. Against West Virginia, I think it was something like 4 out of 5, 5 out of 6 as well. Once the offense got going, they were fine. But, USC is a team where I'm sure this Saturday they know this is do or die for the 2024 season for USC. And, I would like to think that Lincoln Riley is going to rally the troops and they're going to come out and play like it. And that's the kind of scenario where a slow start, you could find yourself in a 14-0 kind of hole real quick. So, yeah, that has definitely been a point of emphasis. Now, one thing James Franklin's also mentioned, and I don't think he necessarily wants this trend to continue, but in 2016, when Penn State last won the Big Ten, that's how they were. They were a second half team. They would start slow almost every week and rally in the second half. But eventually that's going to bite you. And that year they bit them in the Pitt game, and that Pitt game kept them out of the playoff. Now, obviously the playoff thing is much different now than it was in 2016, but at the same time, that is definitely an emphasis. I think a big emphasis this week for Penn State is getting off to a faster start. And to circle back to our conversation about the passing game, that's part of the reason why I wonder if we see an attempted deep shot early in the first quarter from Penn State. Kind of in a way, let's get Drew in a rhythm, let's get some confidence, let's get some points on the board and see if maybe that can help jumpstart this offense a little bit quicker.
We do appreciate you all being here at the Voice of College Football. We get together every Tuesday and Friday, so the big call-in show with Tim and Matt is on Friday. That's at 10 Eastern, 7 Pacific. Again, Trojan Conquest, we're right here with all the big topics concerning USC football in a must-win situation. Marty just said it. There we go, Tim. Matt, we put the bar at 10-2. All we had to do is look at the 10-year history of the 14 playoff and extend that to 12 in terms of what the committee has done. There would only be one 9-3 team ever make the playoff, and that's been that dividing line, and USC has no room for error for what most people, I think, would have considered, especially if we could rewind back to third quarter, early fourth quarter at the Big House when USC was feeling good about itself, an LSU win in hand, and a Michigan win appeared to be in hand, but things have gone sour now with 2 losses in 3 games, and again, no room for error.
No, that's exactly where the Trojans are, and you just have to wonder in this 12-team playoff era. Like the guys in the locker room know that 10-2 is what they probably needed to make the playoff, and like this is a pride game. I mean, it might seem cliche, but you're not really thinking, oh, if we win this game, we can make the playoff. I mean, narrowly, technically, that's true, but it's more a matter of, hey, we just need to be USC. We just need to, take pride in this jersey, this uniform that we're wearing. We're playing Penn State on national television. We just need to start playing well. And because USC just has not played a complete 60-minute game against a reasonably good team yet this season. And when you look at where Lincoln Riley's failing, I mean, I'm seeing a lot of people in the chat criticize the play selection. There are going to be a couple plays in a game where the coach doesn't dial up the right play. The number one thing, and by the way, it's not the offensive line, like that's number 2. The number one thing is accountability. I mean, and it's there on defense, but it is not there on offense. Dropped passes week after week, blown missed assignments by the offensive line week after week. Guys not communicating week after week. Guys not being ready in the first quarter week after week. The elite coaches get accountability on a relatively consistent basis. It's not going to happen all the time. Like we saw Kalen DeBoer in Alabama trip up against Vanderbilt. You will see any coach is going to have a bad day. His team steps into a pothole. That happens. But like most of the time, Kalen DeBoer is on it, right? The 6-0 record against Sark, Kirby, and Lanning combined. Like he's a legit heavyweight coach. Lincoln Riley was a heavyweight coach. He's losing the mustard on his fastball, and he's losing it. We can look at the micro, but the macro is the lack of accountability, the not having players ready to weed out mistakes at the start of games. So like that is fundamentally where USC is falling short. So Marty, turning the conversation back to Saturday's game, like what would you say are your foremost points of concern and your foremost points of optimism for the Nittany Lions?
I think my main point of concern, the USC being in the position they're in, I think is part of a concern if you're Penn State. I think honestly, if you're Penn State, you would have rathered the referees rolled that Brosmer short on that sneak on Saturday night and USC pulled that thing out in overtime, because I think you'd be getting a lot less desperate of a USC team. And anytime you're playing a desperate team, especially on the road, and a desperate team with talent, that's always tricky. And again, like I said, this passing game, because the best, it sounds weird to say, but it's probably the truth. The best passing game I think Penn State's faced this year is Bowling Green, and for a half, Bowling Green kind of had their way with the secondary. Now, there were a lot of factors in that game. They were having a ton of issues in the first half with the headsets getting play calls in. So at halftime, they completely scrapped how they were getting their play calls in on defense. And in the second half, they only gave up like 60 yards or something. So I think that was probably a major, major problem. But again, like we said earlier, until you see this secondary, especially without their best player, go against a formidable passing attack like this and have success, you're going to have concerns. And I think one other, maybe not a true concern because it's probably more of a coincidence than anything, but probably worth mentioning, the last 2 times Penn State climbed into the top 4 was 2021, where they go to number 4 and then immediately go to Kinnick Stadium and lose. And in 2019, where they got to number 4 and then immediately went to Minneapolis and lost to Minnesota. So the last 2 times they've gotten into the top 4, they've gone on the road the next week and lost to a conference opponent. Now, different scenarios. Both of those teams, Iowa and Minnesota, are both undefeated. And Sean Clifford got hurt in that Iowa game. But still, I can guarantee you that is something James Franklin will be harping on behind the scenes this week because that's just the kind of guy he is. For the optimism, for me, the biggest thing is in the trenches. I think Penn State is so much better, both on the offense and defensive line than USC from what I've seen this year from USC, having watched the Michigan and the Minnesota games. And even the LSU game where I thought Danton Lynn did a nice job of baiting LSU into throwing the ball a lot more in the second half than they needed to, where I think if LSU would have stuck with the run more, that game may have gone differently. So I'm very confident in Penn State's ability to win in the trenches. And, ultimately it's football. You win in the trenches, you're probably going to win the game. And also as wild as it sounds for anybody to be saying this, like at this point, I'm not sure. I think overall Penn State is a coaching advantage. I'm not necessarily going to say James Franklin's a better head coach than Lincoln Riley because Lincoln has still accomplished more. But, I mean, right now there are a few play callers in the country I would trust more than Andy Kotelnicki in a game. And while USC's defense has come a long, long way, obviously he's a Penn State guy. I'm very high on Danton Lynn. I think he's got an extremely bright future. Tom Allen's been there, done that, and we've seen Tom Allen with a lot less talented defenses than he has this year shut down teams on the road before. So I think those would be my points of optimism for Penn State. But like I said, the biggest one to me is just in the trenches because Penn State's offensive line has played extremely well this year. Their defensive line has been even better, and I just have a really hard time seeing USC being able to consistently block them and hold up against them. There's been a lot of people in Penn State circles this week who have kind of referenced the 2022 Auburn game, talking about this, where that was a game that at halftime was 14-6, and then you looked up in the second half and it was 41-12. Because in the second half, Penn State just wore Auburn down in the trenches and the depth differential took over. I'm not saying I think that's going to happen because I don't think they win by 29 or whatever it was, but I do think that's a comparison and a mindset a lot of people in Penn State circles have because of the optimism around the differences in the trenches here.
So go ahead, Mark.
I was checking out Winsipedia because I'm usually pretty good about figuring out, and with all these crazy conference scenarios now, like with Miami going out to Cal for an ACC game, we determined that the last time Miami was on the West Coast for a conference game was way back in 2000. And I was thinking, when has Penn State gone to Washington State? I'm going down the coast and I'm thinking their last trip for a regular season game on the West Coast had to be at USC. And sure enough, it appears to be in 1991, the last time Penn State went out to USC. Has James Franklin talked at all about this? I remember him at Big Ten Media Days being asked about travel and them really looking at it. And so did he mention anything this week about how that weekly schedule may be adjusted this week?
He hasn't mentioned too much other than the fact they plan to fly out on Thursday. They were debating some of their travel plans. What they're going to do is instead of flying out of State College, and for those who don't know, State College is a tiny airport. It is a pain in the butt to get in and out of. They're actually going to travel to Harrisburg on Thursday, fly out of Harrisburg so they can get there on Thursday and have all day Friday to adjust in terms of the time difference and a potential jet lag, which, I mean, obviously anyone who travels knows that when you're traveling that far, the jet lag is much more severe when you're losing the hours than gaining it, but your body still needs to adjust to the time zone. But outside of that, I don't expect too much to be different. They had practice tonight in Haluba Hall. They will have their open session for the media on Wednesday still. I'm sure they will still do their usual Friday and Saturday, just they'll be doing it out in Los Angeles. And I think some of that is James is such a freak of nature when it comes to this stuff. And that's part of what makes him so successful is he preaches that 1-0 mentality. And as goofy as it sounds, it works. So I think he wants to keep to his schedule as best as possible this week. So other than Thursday being a travel day where they'll be flying from Harrisburg to LAX, I don't think too much is really going to be out of the norm for them this week, or at least, as close to normal as you possibly can be when one of the days in your week has to involve flying to the other side of the country.
I did see a stat from John Wilner, the Wilner hotline, that the Big Ten teams that have traveled 2 or more time zones are 1-7 so far.
I did see that as well. Yeah,
that was an eye grabber. So it'll be interesting to see what happens this weekend. All right, let's get into tactics a little bit and the coordinators specifically. How do you think D'Anton Lynn is going to go at this Penn State offense? Like knowing what you know about D'Anton Lynn, seeing what you've seen of him, how he operates, what do you think D'Anton Lynn's going to try to do for Penn State, and how do you think Kotelnicki counters? Like, how do you think the chess match between D'Anton Lynn and Andy Kotelnicki, like that is appointment television on CBS.
I agree. Yeah, two
so how do you think that chess match is going to unfold?
Yeah, I agree with you. It's appointment television. 2 of the brightest young minds in the country. One of the best up and rising offense coordinators, one of the best up and rising defense coordinators. I'm very curious to see what Lynn does, because if I'm playing Penn State, even with the steps the passing game has taken, I am still, at least to start the game, you're going to beat me throwing the ball. I'm not letting Nick Singleton and Katron Allen beat me. I will move my safeties up. I will put an extra guy in the box. I will put my corners out there against your receivers and trust them to make plays. And if that's not working, I'll adjust. So I'm going to be curious to see if Lynn takes an approach like that, because as you mentioned earlier, there's some serious concerns about the current state of the USC secondary. So I wonder then too, and I'm not sure how much of this he's done based off of what I've watched of him, especially that Michigan game. You can almost throw the entire defensive game plan out the window because Michigan was essentially running the triple option. How aggressive does he get maybe with blitzing to try and disrupt Drew Aller? Because that's when Drew does struggle at times if he doesn't have a clean pocket. And I mean, again, this is most quarterbacks, but if he doesn't have a super clean pocket, sometimes he can rush. He doesn't go through his reads well. And if it's like, hey, you know what? We don't necessarily trust our secondary to hold up. Let's just try and get to the quarterback and not give him time to make plays and make reads and make throws. So I'll be very curious to see how he goes about that. As for Kotelnicki, again, like I mentioned earlier, I wouldn't be surprised to see Penn State come out and try a shot play early to be aggressive, to get into a groove and get over the slow start. I also think you're going to see Nicholas Singleton, again, assuming he is 100%, which seems like that's what they expect. See a heavy dose of him early, because I don't think it's a coincidence that against UCLA, when they didn't have him, was when the offense really started slow as opposed to other games. So I think you're going to see a lot of Nick Singleton. I think you're going to see them take some deep shots early. And I will be very curious also. They have talked a lot about the Bo Pribula package. Bo Pribula is their backup quarterback who is the laziest comparison in the world as people compare him to Tracy McSorley. He's a better runner than he's a thrower. He wears number 9. He's about a 6-foot tall white dude. Like, he is Trace 2.0. And we've seen some of the Pribula package this year, but it's been very vanilla. Bo it's 3rd and 2, and you run it with him because you get the extra blocker to get the first down. I think he's only thrown it out of it a couple times. I'm very curious to see if they have anything dialed up out of that we haven't seen yet, because we've seen a lot of it where Drew stays on the field and is flanked out wide. Do you maybe get a double pass or something out of that? Because Kotelnicki, I know at Kansas, that was one of his trademarks, was the creativity and the trick play. So I'll be very interested to see if he has anything of that sort up his sleeve on Saturday as well. Again, especially if you are in a position where you want to jumpstart this offense, or maybe you come out early and get 14-0, 14-3, and maybe see an opportunity to go for an early jugular. Does he pull something out of the bag of tricks? So that's something I'll be watching closely with Kotelnicki on Saturday as well.
Now, to the other side, I can just imagine, I can envision Tom Allen having saliva dripping from the side of his mouth, looking at that Swiss cheese USC offensive line. So how do you think Tom Allen is going to try to exploit USC's weakness up front? Do you think that Allen is going to try and use a lot of stunts and twists to get the USC into those communication situations where you have like USC's had situations, especially against Wisconsin 2 weeks ago. Two guys focus on one rusher, and then the other guy comes in free. Or do you think Tom Allen tries to keep it simple? You know what? We're just going to bring our base front four. We think we can win with those guys, and we're going to keep people in coverage to focus on not getting beaten by USC's receivers. So you think Tom Allen goes exotic in the attempt to just confuse USC right from the start? Or do you think he kind of hangs back first quarter at least, hopes that his base front four can do the job, because then he can just have so many guys back in coverage to make sure that Miller Moss won't have a deep shot all day? How do you think Tom Allen plays this?
From what I've seen of Tom Allen this year, and I mean, obviously as a Big Ten guy, I watched a lot of Tom Allen defense over the years, well before he's at Penn State. I personally would guess he probably starts in that base, largely because he knows Penn State has advantage in the trenches. And not just that, it's a deep group. Penn State's going to rotate 5 guys at defensive tackle. They're going to rotate 4 guys at defensive end, all of which they're confident in, all of which they view as future NFL guys with potentially 2 future first-round picks out of that group. It's a very deep, talented group. So I think you're going to see him start out with that, trusting that front four to make plays. And if that's not working, I think that's when you're going to see them maybe get a bit more exotic, bring a linebacker. I could see Tony Rojas, their will linebacker, being used to blitz a lot, or potentially Jalen Reed walking up from safety to kind of play more of that Sam linebacker safety hybrid and being used as a blitzer. In that scenario, you can still drop 6 in the coverage. I also think Saturday is going to be a game where you're going to see Abdul Carter deployed all over the field. I don't think it's going to be just straight lineup at defensive end. We saw a lot of that against Illinois also, something they used to do with Micah Parsons a lot back in the day, something they started to do with Carter some last year and continued this year, is stand him up over the center or in an A or B gap and just cut him loose and, wish that interior offensive line the best of luck. And, the stats haven't always been there this year for Carter, but there's been a lot of TFLs and a lot of sacks and quarterback hits and pressures that have happened because they do that with Carter. And all of a sudden you've got a center, a guard, and a running back all focused on him. So it frees up somebody else. So I think you're going to see Abdul Carter deployed all over the field as well in pass rush situations. So I think you're going to see Allen, like I said, try and start basic because he knows his defensive line has an advantage over this USC offensive line. And then if that's not working, get a little bit more exotic with the blitzing potentially. But even this year, when the few times that the defensive line has kind of struggled to get into a gear or get home early in games, he stayed away from the exotic blitzing because I think Allen is a guy who really does like to run that man coverage and knows that if you blitz in, you blitz paired with that, you're putting yourself in a tough spot. So I think he'll start base. We're going to see Carter, I think, deployed all up and down the line in pass rush situations. And, just a lot of stunts and twists, just, the basic. Nothing super exotic, but exotic enough that it can confuse an offensive line, especially if you're already maybe on your heels a little bit, like I think he's probably anticipating happening.
I was just going to say, I'm reminded that during the offseason leading into week 1, our buddy Steve Merrill of Wager Talk, our resident odds maker, handicapper, and I were recording a segment on Heisman candidates. And then he was going through the recent history of Heisman candidates and basically making the case that your money is best placed on not the leading candidate or the number 2 guy, 3 guy, but it's usually a guy way down the list. Devontae Smith and others have jumped from 25, 30, 35 to 1 shots. And it's ironic that he asked me, said, okay, Mark, give me 2 guys that you think could win the Heisman that are way down this board. And I said, Drew Aller and Miller Moss. Well, neither one of those guys is going to win the Heisman this year. But my point is they are facing this week. And Dillon Gabriel, if you ask most college football fans, in a marginal college football quarterback conference, most fans would say Dillon Gabriel is the best quarterback because he gets the Lifetime Achievement Award. He's the most prolific. I don't know that he's the best quarterback in the conference, especially based on what I saw against Michigan State last week. I'm not saying that he's not the best, but these 2 definitely have a shot. Do we think that there is any separation between these 2? I think they're extremely comparable.
My response would simply be that our has the better offensive line, and I think the offensive lines magnify what these quarterbacks are and aren't able to do. And that's the point that really goes back to a lot of USC fans' complaints. A lot of USC fans think Lincoln Riley's play calling is not cutting it, and I think to a certain degree that's true. I think in the Minnesota game, though, just to address this point, on the series of downs that led to the interception that changed the game, USC ran on 1st and 10, ran on 2nd and 5, and the interception occurred on 3rd and 4. I didn't see Lincoln Riley abandoning the run. Now, if you wanted to say, you know what, 3rd and 4, Minnesota 36-yard line, you should run there, and then, knowing that you can still go for him 4th down. I mean, yes, but like the fact that an interception occurred on that play doesn't mean that it was dumb to pass on 3rd and 4. I don't think you can say that. And I don't think you can say Lincoln Riley went away from the run. USC was running the ball fairly consistently. And again, ran the ball 1st and 2nd down on that series of downs when the game-changing interception occurred. It's not as though USC passed on the 2 plays before the interception. But Lincoln Riley is obviously not calling his plays in such a way to adjust for the weaknesses of the offensive line. Like you'd think Lincoln Riley would know, okay, I have limitations here, so let me call plays that adjust to my offensive line's limitations. On that count, yes, Lincoln Riley's play calling has not measured up. But I think more broadly, when we look at Miller Moss, he was always going to need help. He's not the guy who does everything. He's the guy who works within the structure of the offense. Look at the Holiday Bowl against Louisville. Look at the LSU game. When he got enough time to throw, when his teammates did their jobs, they put Miller Moss in position to succeed, and he'll make the right throw. He's not getting the help. It's not a verdict on Miller Moss. It's a verdict on USC's offensive line and on Lincoln Riley not putting Miller Moss in the best possible position to succeed. And Marty can speak to Drew Auer more particularly, but the larger point that I'm making is pretty clear. It's not so much the quarterback himself, is that if a quarterback is not Caleb Williams, if he's not Jaden Daniels, if he's not Jalen Milroe, guy who can do so many different things and take a bigger burden on his shoulders. If a quarterback is not out cut in that mold, he's going to need the help from his teammates. So what the verdict is on Auer at Penn State, I'm going to leave that one to Marty.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with the offensive line thing completely, Matt. I mean, honestly, I feel like if you could take Penn State's offensive line, combine it with USC's receivers, then throw in Nicholas Singleton, I mean, you'd have the dream scenario for a quarterback. But, yeah, I think that's where it's interesting to me because Miller Moss obviously has the better receivers. Drew clearly has the better offensive line and then running backs and running game to go with it. From a pure talent standpoint, I still think Drew probably is a little bit better, but in my opinion, there are very few quarterbacks in the country, if any, who have the just pure God-given ability and arm talent of Drew Aller. That said, I think anyone who would take Miller Moss over Drew, I can understand that because you've kind of seen more in game from Moss. And now I think some of that is the system Lincoln Riley runs. I think some of that this year has been he's had to do it because USC hasn't really had too many of their options offensively. Again, circling back to the offensive line and the running game. But like you said, unfortunately, Miller Moss, and again, not a knock on him, is not the quarterback who's built to do that. Is Drew Aller a quarterback who's built to have to put the team on his back and carry them week in and week out if need be? We don't know. And part of it is because with the way Penn State's built, you don't need to know because they have an offensive line and they have a running game that most weeks is going to be there. So, yeah, I think that, and again, I've hit it throughout the show where to me the biggest difference is in the trenches, and I think that's the biggest difference between these teams. Because if you look at these teams up and down, I don't think they're that much different in overall talent. I mean, I think Penn State's defense definitely is still a step or so ahead of USC's, but I think USC with a little bit better offensive line play, the gap between their offense and Penn State's would be somewhat significant also. So again, football so many times from Pee Wee on up is going to come down to play in the trenches. And that's, to me, where the biggest gap is between these teams. And that's why I agree with what you said earlier, Matt, too, that I think Penn State probably winds up putting this game on Saturday.
Matt, it was a narrative all off season, but even going back to the time that it was announced that these West Coast teams were moving into the Big Ten, and just these enormous Big Ten fan bases descending on various points out west. Yes, we're looking at you first and foremost, UCLA, and just taking over the stadium. UCLA was the easy target, of course. USC dropping a second game. Do you think the fan base may be teetering on the point that Penn State is going to be plucking up tickets and making it much less of a home field advantage?
I certainly think there's if you live in central Pennsylvania or Pittsburgh or Philadelphia and you're a Nittany Lion fan, you should be checking flights to LA. I mean, I'll just leave it at that, right? Because, during the Pete Carroll heyday, when everything was rocking and rolling and the program was an unquestioned heavyweight, the Coliseum was stuffed to the gills. But yeah, 2 losses before the middle of October. I think there are going to be plenty of Penn State fans there, or at the very least, there are going to be plenty of tickets to be had. So if you're a Penn State fan watching this show here at the Voice of College Football, and you're thinking, what are my chances of getting a decent seat? I'd say those chances are pretty good.
Yeah, and I'll build off that real quick. I will say, I think when this schedule came out, this was a game that a lot of Penn State fans in general circled anyway. The weather around here hasn't been too bad lately, but typically the middle of October, the weather in LA is a hell of a lot nicer than anywhere else in Pennsylvania. So I think you combine that with what people probably circled as, hey, this should be a good game, 2 really good programs, 2 kind of iconic programs. Obviously this was eons ago now in the world of college football, but the last time these 2 played, it was an instant classic. I think for a lot of reasons, this was a game that a lot of Penn State fans probably circled back in the offseason anyway as, hey, our yearly road trip game. Let's try and get out to the Coliseum this year. So, I won't be stunned if there is a decent amount of white in the stands on Saturday.
One last thing from me, and Marty, you've heard this so many times, I don't even expect you to really respond to it, but I'm watching the Fox broadcast, and of course it was UCLA, so it was basically over from the first series. We knew what it was going to be, but much of that time was spent on, has Penn State done what it needs to do to catch Ohio State and Michigan? Well, they don't play Michigan this year. And then the thought is also, does it matter that they've caught Ohio State and Michigan this year? Because we got a 12-team playoff, and they're going to play different teams in the playoff, and they don't have to be the best team in the Big Ten. They can be the 3rd or 4th best team in the Big Ten and then catch fire and do it during the playoff. I don't even know what I'm asking you there. I just, that again is just a narrative that is recycled, but with a different spin, at least this year, because of the 12-team playoff.
Yeah, and it's a narrative. I can even say on our boards at Happy Valley Insider, if a kid commits, you'll have 7 comments right about, well, is he good enough to beat Ohio State? Could this kid play at Ohio State? Would Ohio State offer this kid? And I'm well, you can go look at his offer list. A lot of times they do have Ohio State offers. Yes, it's definitely the narrative. But yeah, again, to me, it's in the 12-team playoff. Yes, you still want to beat Ohio State, but it's not as pertinent as it once was. I think that's part of what makes this an important game for Penn State too, because if you look at their remaining schedule after this, if Penn State wins this game on Saturday, in my opinion, at least, something has to go catastrophically wrong for them not to go at least 11-1. And at 11-1 in the Big Ten, you're not only in the playoff, in my opinion, you're probably comfortably playing at home in the first round. So, yeah, it is what it is. I mean, people are always going to have that Ohio State bug up their butt, I think. And I honestly think so much of it, not to get too far off on it here, but it goes back to when Penn State first came to the Big Ten. Because before Penn State joined the Big Ten, anyone the first decade or so in the Big Ten, they were a perennial powerhouse. They were a top 5 program year in and year out, and playing that kind of Eastern-based independent schedule. Once Pitt started to fall off in the 80s, they didn't really have too much competition. Well, when you got to the Big Ten, and you had the John Cooper years at first, so Ohio State wasn't really Ohio State there for a few years. once the Tressel years kicked in, that kind of aligned with Penn State taking a step back for the last few years of Paterno. And I think that's just kind of always set wrong with a lot of Penn State fans, where for so long, Penn State was that dominant program week in, week out on their schedule. Once they kind of got replaced by Ohio State as that, I think that's always kind of created this natural animosity. And then you just, with what Ohio State has become and Penn State only having won once out of the last 10 years or whatever it is, it's a disdain that I think is built on respect, because Ohio State is what so many Penn State fans want Penn State to be and aspire for Penn State to be. But the problem is there's like 4 Ohio States in the country. So, in the 12-team playoff era, like you said, it's I'm not even sure where you go with it, but if you're consistently winning 10 games in the Big Ten, and should this matter? No, but it does. When you've got the name brand of a Penn State slapped beside those 10 wins, you're going to make it a lot of times.
Great stuff. Anything else, Matt?
No, Marty, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. And
absolutely.
Best of luck with the rest of the season.
Thank you. You as well. Hopefully we get a good game on Saturday.
Absolutely.
We want to make sure everybody's aware. Marty Leap, Penn State Rivals. You see his IDs right there. Just follow him at Marty L _53. And then you see the Penn State Rivals as well. It's easy to look up right here online, of course. Marty, appreciate you stopping by. Enjoy the game on Saturday.
Absolutely. See you guys.
Which brings me to something for you, Matt. We've seen either 3 or 4 Big Ten games out of each team now. Is there anything in particular that strikes you? And I'll lead it in this way. What strikes me, and maybe this is just because I posted a Big Ten power rankings early this morning, I believe it was, that, I think Ohio State's the best team in the conference. Obviously, Oregon's going to have much to say about that coming up on Saturday. So maybe Oregon's going to be the best team in the conference, and Ohio State's going to slot in it too. And then Penn State, regardless of what happens, and most likely they win Saturday and they stay at 3 in people's minds. But you and I are all about the results, of course. But, man, I look at that 4 to 13, 10 teams in this conference. I didn't think I was going to put USC. I thought that they were going to be a notch above, kind of in their own category there under Ohio State and Oregon with Penn State, let's say. But, man, I look at these matchups. Rutgers beat Washington. Washington beat Michigan. Michigan beat Minnesota. Minnesota beat USC. Michigan beat USC. It seems like you've got Illinois beat Nebraska. It seems like Indiana's beating everyone at this point. It'll be interesting to see if that continues. We've got like 10 teams in that mid-tier that seem to be almost interchangeable. They come in different shapes and sizes, but they're interchangeable.
Totally agree. It's a big jumble right now. Like some seasons you see a number of teams clearly rising above the rest. You don't have that right now. And obviously what you're going to see with Penn State, USC, and especially Ohio State, Oregon, that's going to give us a lot more information. It's going to give us a lot more context in terms of how the Big Ten shakes up. But right now, it's extremely fluid. And also these games are close, and they're also close to the vest. Like, I think that's another Big Ten talking point, that so far, we wondered, would like the Pac-12 newcomers make the conference more wide open, or would the old guard, be able to play its style of football? So far, it's the old guard of the Big Ten being able to play its style of football. The West Coast in newcomers, they're not pitching it around the ballpark and putting up video game numbers. Just hasn't worked out that way. One interesting point is that that travel item that I mentioned earlier from John Wilner about teams that are making these long distance commutes not faring very well. And it's kind of interesting that, we heard so many coaches at Big Ten Media Day say, well, we've consulted the NFL teams and the NFL experts. Wait a minute. NFL athletes and college athletes are on different schedules. They have different life demands. If you're a professional athlete, you just have to, prepare yourself to play a game. These college athletes, they have NIL, they have their studies, they have their girlfriends. it struck me as hilarious. Wait a minute. Why are you consulting NFL people? It's not the same experience. It's not the same frame of reference. So, I just have to scratch my head and wonder in bafflement why the NFL was seen as like the gold standard. Those guys are used to the travel. Those guys are used to the rigors of the sport, not the college athletes. Like USC should be getting into these Big Ten road locations as early as realistically possible. You shouldn't be flying in late. Like sleep in the same Minneapolis hotel bed 2 nights in a row before you play your game. Sleep in the same foreign environment a couple nights in a row. Don't be parachuting in at the last minute. Like that just seems so misguided. So it seems that just coaches in general, I'm not focusing on West Coast coaches specifically because like Eastern teams going west, they're also having a problem. But just it seems as though everyone's getting used to this new world, and that seems to be affecting the offenses. It seems to be creating a situation where, you're not seeing the full dynamism, the full athleticism of various offensive players fully take root. These pieces aren't being put together as well as they could be or should be. I mean, that's not just a USC thing. It does apply to USC, but you're seeing it throughout the conference. I mean, the one guy who's really knocking it out of the park, we can agree, Curt Cignetti. The Sig is lit in Bloomington. The way he is just putting everything together for the Hoosiers. Like he looks like a rock star. I mean, now we can discuss who should be the next Florida Gator head coach, and obviously Lane Kiffin's going to be bandied about. If I'm in Gainesville and Lane Kiffin says no, Curt Cignetti is right there at the top of my list. And if that was me, I'm speaking only for myself. So, but in general, it seems as though this Big Ten season, we're waiting to see it take off because we've seen close games, but close games that are a function of parity, close games that are a function of neither team being so good that it can gain separation. It's not these meetings on the mountaintop, It's not like an epic battle where two teams are both bringing their 100-mile-an-hour fastball on the outside corner, and it's just slugging it out and haymakers are being thrown. No, it's games that are close because neither team can really separate itself. It's like the Isner-Mahou Wimbledon tennis match. Like both guys' returns of serve were absolute garbage. That's why you got 70-68 in the fifth set. This Big Ten season with all these close games feels much the same way. Like USC Minnesota, it was not this epic battle. It was a pillow fight. And as soon as USC lost Anthony Lucas, that was the tipping point for that defense. You held the fort without Gentry and Bear Alexander, but you lose Anthony Lucas in addition to that, and you don't get enough help from your offense to get a 20-10 lead or a 24-10 lead, and it remained a one-score game. USC put itself in jeopardy, put itself in position to lose. So, yeah, the Big Ten is just a big jumble right now, and we'll see if mid-October gives us the beginnings of some separation and some a first tier, a second tier, a third tier. But right now, it's just a really, really big jumble.
I think Ohio State and Oregon have that chance to deliver that epic matchup. What we saw last week out of Ohio State is Iowa being on the upper end of that jumbled mess. Ohio State and Oregon against Michigan State, just when all these other games, as you note, are just these 20-17 rock fights. Those are the two teams that seem to be clamping down now on all their opponents. And of course, they'll get together. That should be fascinating. Matt, I'm sure you will appreciate this. I believe you will. Is I took the AP to task here. I started to look over the AP because a number of people had brought this to my attention, a number of rankings flaws, as is typical every week. And I'm looking through some of these rankings, and they make absolutely no sense, of course. That's, of course, why we do our top 25. That actually makes sense. It's based on the results. Michigan and Washington. This is just one example of many. Michigan and Washington, they just played Saturday. Washington wins by 10 points. They're both 4-2. Washington lost to Rutgers because they missed 3 field goals. Not that that's an excuse. That's part of the game. But let's understand evaluation of play. They lose to Washington State because they get stopped at the goal line inside the 5. Michigan, one of their wins is a really ugly hang on to the side of the cliff against Minnesota. And Michigan's number 21 in the country, and Washington's barely receiving votes, back 13 or 14 spots from Michigan. They just played Saturday.
Absolute crazy pants. Absolute crazy pants. And I mean, what is the reason for that? We all know that. Michigan's reputation. Michigan was national champion last year. I mean, Michigan was number 10 going into that game. Yeah. And there's no way Michigan was a top 10 team going into that game. And of course, with USC losing a second time, that should devalue Michigan's resume. But again, it's reputation, right? It's so baked into how voters process and handle these rankings week to week. It's really rather ridiculous.
Yeah, you can't tell me that Missouri's struggling against a Boston College team and winning by less than a touchdown and beating Vandy in overtime and then getting completely annihilated by Texas A&M should be still in the rankings. But they're in the rankings because they started in the rankings.
That's right. So, there's not a lot of meat on the bone for Missouri's resume, but yeah, because they were number 9, we can't knock them fully out of the top 25. Wait a minute. Is that some kind of rule? Is that some kind of law or statute? Yep, this is how it's done, and it just makes the two of us absolutely insane every time it happens.
It does. So, folks, if you're into that sort of thing, check out on the main channel. Just posted a video on my top 25 that actually makes sense, and you can compare that to my irritation with the AP and the coaches poll as well. Matt, what's going on at Trojans Wire?
Well, so I wrote a piece called "Lincoln Riley is Paying the Price for His 2023 Mistakes at USC." It's been our most read story of this college football season, and USC having 2 losses, I'm prepared for the page view collapse that's coming in the second half of the season, with USC probably not playing games that are going to have championship or playoff implications. This Penn State game is like a final attempt to salvage this season and go into late October, early November still with just 2 losses. But I can't say I'm optimistic about Penn State. But Trojans Wire and our partners at Nittany Lions Wire, we are going to be covering this game all week long. So Trojans Wire and Nittany Lions Wire for plenty of Penn State USC coverage. And there you can see, upper right-hand corner, Lincoln Riley pays the price. So that's been the story. Tried to knit a lot of things together about the larger overall situation at USC. The other stories that you see there deal with it too. The defensive depth, that point, other things. But we're getting into the meaty issues, trying to give readers a grown-up, serious explanation for why things are happening the way they are at USC.
Once again, we so much thank QLJ for being a new member here at the Voice of College Football USC. Great to have you on board. Check out all the segments that Matt and I provide as those bonus choice cuts. There are 17 of those. 17 segments concerning all sorts of USC football topics, both historic and current and Big Ten related. And then Detective Loki, thank you so much for gifting a USC channel membership. We appreciate your loyalty and support here at the Voice of College Football. All right, Matt, this should be a good game. I, like you, am heavily leaning on the Penn State end. Matt has a tremendous prediction record going right now. I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but you can catch those as a Patreon member / MarkRogersTV, or being a member at the main channel, the main national channel here at the Voice of College Football.
So I hope my prediction is wrong for this week.
Yeah. Now, determining the 5.5-point spread and navigating that is a different deal, certainly. But yeah,
I will take Penn State minus the 5.5.
Okay. Okay.
I mean, my predicted score for the USC Minnesota game was USC 30, Minnesota 23. So USC by 7. So I had the Gophers plus the 8. So, that hit, because the main thing with USC is this: you can't give the benefit of the doubt to a team that hasn't earned it. And that's why I took Minnesota plus the 8, plus the 8.5, whatever the line ended up being. Like, USC has to prove it's a really good team before you start betting on that team against the spread and you give that team the benefit of the doubt. USC has to earn it. It's that simple. So if USC goes out and beats Penn State outright, I will then, revisit and rethink how I treat USC relative to any betting lines. But certainly for this game, I'm thinking, Penn State should at least be able to win by a touchdown. Again, I hope I'm loudly, horribly wrong, but I think that's pretty clear cut from what I've seen.
I really wrestled with that 8-point spread, and I finally opted for USC. I just thought, okay, I can see this being a really tight game, but that USC's skill position advantage, I thought that they would break off a couple big plays in the fourth quarter and widen that gap and maybe get it done by 10 or 13 points. Didn't happen. How surprised were you that they lost the game?
Somewhat. But I'm certainly not surprised it was close, and that's the recurring theme, that USC is playing to the level of its competition. Every game is pretty close, if not at the end, certainly through 3 quarters, and you just can't keep living on that tightrope, right? USC needs to be getting 2 touchdown, 17-point leads. Now, it finished the Wisconsin game with a 17-point advantage, but that was a late Mason Cobb interception for a little bit of window dressing. Obviously, that game was much closer than the final 17-point tally. USC just needs to be gaining separation, and it really hasn't gained separation in any non-Utah State game this season. So, like Bill Parcells said, your record is what you are what your record says you are, right? And I would just extend that. Your patterns say what kind of team you are. So until USC breaks from some of these patterns, I can't say I was absolutely stunned about the loss, but certainly when USC was leading 17-10 at the Minnesota 36, 3rd and 4, I'm thinking, all right, now we should put this game away. This should be a W, but USC and its offensive line in crunch time in these Big Ten road games has fallen apart. Remember when USC had the ball with the 4-point lead against Michigan, 5 minutes left, the offensive line just gets caved in. And Lincoln Riley's play calls were not great. But you know what? When your offensive line is not playing well in big crunch time situations, let's say this, folks, everyone watching here at the Voice of College Football. Riley's play calling has definitely not been the best, but you need this offensive line to play better. You need that marriage. You need a marriage of your play selection and your offensive linemen doing their job. It's both. We shouldn't put it all in one basket. It's both. The play calling is going to get better if the offensive line becomes more consistent. And the inconvenient and very lamentable truth about this offensive line, played an outstanding 3rd quarter. Again, this offensive line has played so well in 3rd quarters all season long. If the offensive line can play so well in 3rd quarters specifically, it was really solid in that 3rd quarter at Michigan, really solid coming out of the blocks against Wisconsin, and that USC offensive line was mashing against Minnesota. USC was rearing back and finally just pounding the rock, 12-play, 91-yard, 7-minute touchdown drive, the best USC drive of the whole season. You're seeing moments when this offensive line plays well, but the fact that it plays so well in 3rd quarters makes the bad first halves, the sloppy first quarters, and then the rickety closing stretches in these Michigan and Minnesota games, it makes it all the more puzzling and annoying. that why can't this offensive line play well for at least, forget 60, all right? 45 minutes would be a significant improvement. Right now, this is a 25 to 30 minute offensive line. It has played really good football for about 25 to 30 minutes in most of its games. Tossing aside Utah State, the cupcake. If you can play 25 to 30 good minutes, can you at least play 45 good minutes? I mean, forget about 60 for now. Let's get 45 good minutes, 3 good quarters from this USC offensive line, and let's see how far this team can go. Because I'm not expecting 60 complete minutes from this line. Let's see if it can get to 45 good minutes. Let's see how far USC can go with that. Let's see if it's going to be enough against Penn State. We'll all find out. But like Josh Henson, he's very much on the hot seat. If USC's offensive line gets dump trucked by Penn State, for me, that's it. That's it. Like, we have to see something really special against Penn State, and then we need to see progress, clear, consistent progress over the second half of the season, if there is to be even a chance, even any remote chance that Josh Henson gets retained. Because, and I wrote about this at Trojans Wire too, Josh Henson is in the Alex Grinch zone. And I'm not talking just about the hot seat. I'm talking about just the fundamental point. At some point in a coach's tenure, you realize he is not the best this team, school, NFL organization, whatever, can do. Josh Henson is not the best USC can do as offensive line coach. And so when you realize that this position coach is not the best you can do, that is the point at which you say, goodbye, we need to start fresh, need to get a skull crusher, need to get someone better to come in. So unless we see a really strong performance, and I'm going to grade that by the metric I just raised a little bit earlier, can we get 45 quality minutes? I'd love 60, but I'm not going to expect that, given what we've seen so far. Can we get 3 strong quarters from this offensive line against Penn State? And if we can't, and it all comes crashing down in a third loss, like, bye-bye. And when USC and Lincoln Riley will need to find a better answer at that position.
I'll end it this way on my side. Folks, think about this. How many times during a long, long college football offseason do we go through the schedule and review the schedule ad nauseum because it's so interesting to think about the matchups? And we do this with every team. And we basically have a 3-category system of, well, that's a win, that's a win, that's a win, that's a win. And then if it's a team of USC's caliber, it's typically not definite losses, but that's going to be a tough one to get. That's going to be, and then there's these 50-50 games somewhere in the middle. Well, Minnesota was such a check mark win to the point that last week, besides having our guest on, we kind of brushed it aside, started talking about Penn State already. Let's talk some Penn State, and that Penn State game is going to be something else, and that's going to be huge. And I will say this. How many times during this offseason, Matt, have I said this? Once USC gets past Michigan one way or the other, which, of course, it was a loss, do they have this string of games in the Big Ten? And none of them outside of Penn State look impressive. They don't. Rutgers, Nebraska, Minnesota, Wisconsin, etc. But I said the week after week of that dull grind, that pounding, that don't be surprised if there's a loss or 2 in there. And there's already been 1. And there are the Nebraskas and Rutgers coming up. I don't know.
And that road trip to Seattle for Washington, like, I'm not optimistic about that one at this point. Like, Washington was able to beat Michigan solidly, and USC couldn't beat Michigan. So yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think one nuance, just to kind of dovetail on that, is that, having an off week in mid-September, this was not good for this team. I'm not making excuses. I'm just saying, you really do not want to have an off week as early as USC had it. You want to get several weeks of momentum and rhythm with your team. You don't want to play 2 games and then pump the brakes and then have to kind of restart. You want your off week in October. You want to play at least a month of football to get rhythm, to kind of just get a feel for how everyone relates to each other. This is not it. Now, I'm not saying that the Big Ten wronged USC. I am merely talking about the dynamics and structure of a favorable schedule. A favorable schedule gives you an off week in October in the middle of the season. Like USC has not. USC had better rhythm before its mid-September off week than it did after. And again, not an excuse. I'm just explaining the mechanics and structure of the schedule. So we'll see if now USC, as we get into the middle of October and this 7-game stretch from Michigan on the September 21st through Washington on November 2nd, let's see if USC actually does begin to develop more cohesion as the season gets later and as we get into late October, early November. Let's see.
Folks, we so much appreciate you being here at the Voice of College Football. This has been Trojan Conquest, of course, and join Matt and Tim Friday, 10 Eastern, 7 where it counts, right there on the West Coast. And Matt, as always, it's always an honor, pleasure to have you here making this show go for us.
Mark, stay safe.